I wanted to take a look at the final chapter of John. So this will be the last one in this series. There are a number of things that happen in that chapter which I just want to explore. Now there is something I just want to kind of get out of the way, because one of the interesting things is that there's been some curious, very controversial stuff going about. And one of them, you may remember a few years ago, there was this book that came out, The Da Vinci Code. And there was even a documentary made on it. And there was this whole idea that actually there was another kind of version of gospel that actually talks about Jesus getting married to Mary of Magdalene and travelling off around the world and having kids and arriving in Scotland of all places and so on. And you kind of think, how on earth, where did all of that come from? And in actual fact, some of it came from a very curious document that is sitting in the British Museum, which is a story of somebody that people says, well, that, although all the names are different and so forth, that we think that actually is Jesus. And it really is a bit of a stretch. And from there, a lot of strange things has happened. And one of the problems with the character of John is that there are things about John that he kind of gets misrepresented in a number of curious ways. And one of the ways that he has been severely misrepresented is in art through history. And both of these are supposed to be John. The one on the left is as he is usually pictured in most Byzantine art, of him as an old man. But the one on the right is a depiction of him that became very common during medieval times. And in fact, part of the Da Vinci Code story is that there is a painting from medieval Europe where it is assumed that Judas has already left the Last Supper, and one of the characters in there who is leaning on Jesus looks like a woman. And that is actually John. And so part of this that supported this whole Da Vinci Code idea is that the disciple, John, who leant on Jesus' breast, as Pete read this morning, the image in this Last Supper scene, he looks like a woman, and so it's assumed that that woman is actually Mary Magdalene. And so this whole myth kind of built up and developed out of that. But as you can see, he was probably the youngest disciple. And so there had been, at first, in some art, depicting him as very young, very boyish features. But somehow in medieval Europe, that kind of developed, and he started looking more and more like a female. And this image on the right with the chalice with what looks like a serpent in it relates to a story, part of the John legend, that he was forced to drink a poison which he survived. And I'll come back to some of that aspect about his life and those aspects of how he survived various attempts to kill him. But let's go back to the beginning of this chapter, the beginning of the story. There's this moment where it seems Peter and the disciples have kind of lost heart. They've lost their way. There's this kind of like, don't really know what to do now, so you know what, I'm going to go fishing. And the other disciples, yeah, okay, we'll come with you as well. There's that moment where it almost seems that they have reached a point where they really just don't know what to do with themselves. This whole experience of Jesus has come to an end. They're lost. They don't really seem to have a purpose. And so they start to go back to their old life. And having spent all night fishing, they've got nothing. It says they've got nothing. Even when Jesus, who they don't actually recognize when he asks the question, do you have any fish? We got nothing. We got absolutely nothing. And then this apparent stranger on the beach says, well, cast your net on the other side. And I think it wasn't the fact that they were doing this in some kind of a faith because they knew who was saying this to them. I think it was one of those, you know what have we got to lose? We haven't caught anything all night. You know, what does it take just to throw the net over the side and see if anything happens at all? And I think that's what probably happened. And so they cast the net on the other side, and suddenly there is this huge haul of fish. So huge, it depends which version you're reading in, but one of them suggests that they were calling the other disciples across to help them in order to bring in this huge haul of fish. And you know, sometimes I come across people who are in business and they have a very successful day in business. And they think, I've had a successful day in business today. Perhaps God is telling me that this is absolutely, I'm in the right place. This is the right place I should be in. And sometimes we can misread these signals. Yes, God has given them a great provision that day. They have had this huge haul. They've had probably their most successful days fishing in their business lives. And they've got this huge haul of fish, which, as the story goes on, they have managed to bring to shore. But sometimes, when we are believers who are looking for signs, we have to see what is God really doing. You know, some of these men have families, and if Jesus wants to take them on, if he wants them to move on and minister in God's power, the families need to be provided for. And here, this big windfall of fish, that if all of this is sold, that it will provide for their families for some time. Did Jesus need the fish? Well, not really. Because the haul of fish is such that John realizes this must be Jesus. And Peter, having been nudged by John on this issue, jumps out of the boat and swims to shore, and the rest of them bring in this haul. In fact, Peter goes back to help them bring the rest of this haul in. But Jesus is already sitting there with a fire. He's already cooking fish. He's already got bread there. And it's interesting, isn't it, that it says in the scripture that they didn't dare to ask who he was because they knew it was Jesus. I think the situation here is that they knew it was Jesus, but something about his appearance was different. Something about it was different. And so they would have liked to have asked, who are you? But actually in their hearts knew. Because this is a miracle that's happened once before. It's a reminder. There's something about him, something about his manner, something about his demeanor that is telling them, yes, this is Jesus. But something about him is not quite, something about his appearance is not quite as it was before. And it's difficult to know what that was because we're given no clues at all. Some people have suggested that certainly we know that the marks in his hands and in his feet were still there, and even the mark in his side was still there in this post-resurrection body. How much more of the marks were there then? Was somehow still some kind of disfigurement there, which was causing them to find it hard to recognize him? But nevertheless, this is his new body. And we just don't know whether it's that or whether there was something so glorious about him, something so wonderful that it was such a great body, such a great new appearance that there was something that they didn't quite recognize. Then Jesus starts to talk to Peter and asks this first question: Peter, do you love me more than these? And this has been another one of those things that there's been a lot of discussion among various scholars. What did Jesus mean by these? Is the question really, do you love me more than you love the other disciples? Or is it a question that says, do you love me more than the other disciples love me? Or even is it, do you love me more than you love your old job and all the boats, nets and equipment? Again, from this text, we do not know which of these things Jesus means. And there is a sense in which perhaps he means all three. Perhaps it's not limited to just one of these. But the thing is that the third one, do you love me more than you love your old job and all the boats, nets and equipment? Well, let's face it, Peter had kind of given up and had gone back to that. He hadn't moved on to take the message of Christ and the gospel on. Bear in mind, this is the third visitation of Christ. They've already seen that he's been raised from the dead on 2 previous occasions. The resurrection is a fact. They know that. But nevertheless, he's given up and he's gone back to his old job. He doesn't seem to feel that he has a purpose in taking this gospel message any further. And this whole conversation, Peter, do you love me, is quite an interesting conversation. In order to look at it in a bit more detail, let's have a look at the 4 Greek words that are often translated for love. First of all, there's agape. This is a Greek word for love that actually comes out of their mythology. It's either the love of a god for a man, or it can be the love of a man for a good god. It's not regarded as agape if for example, the Greek god Hades is, you have a love for that. No, that's not love. That's not agape. You can't do that. The second one is philia, which has more to do with friendship. It's a dispassionate, it's a virtuous love. There's nothing seedy about it. It has to do with good friendship. It has to do with loyalty. It's the kind of love that a man can have for another man without there being any other connotation to it. It's a deep friendship, a deep loyalty to that other man. There's absolutely nothing sexual in that at all. It's a virtuous love. The third Greek word is eros, and it's from that word we get the word erotic. It has to do with intimate and sexual love. And finally, the fourth word is storge, which is almost exclusively used within family relationships. It's the kind of love a parent has for a child. It's the kind of love a child has for a parent at any level, whether you're fully grown and you're having a love for elderly parents or vice versa. It's a family expression. And to really get what is going on in the conversation, we have to understand some of the Greek in that conversation. You see, in the first question, Jesus asks Peter, do you agapasso me? He's asking Peter if he has the kind of love for a God, Jesus. That's the question. The rest of that question is, do you love me more than these? But the first part of that is, do you love me, using the Greek word agapasso. But Peter cannot bring himself to actually answer fully that question. And so he holds back a bit. Yes, Lord, you know that I philo you. He can't bring himself to use that word, agapeo, in order to express his love to Jesus. Now, it's interesting that different versions have what Jesus says next differently. Wasn't aware of Peter's version this morning. I haven't looked at a lot of versions. But the actual word, in your version it said, tend my lambs. The actual word, boske, the Greek, means feed. Feed my lambs. And so that's Jesus' first response at the end of the first question. So then Jesus asks him again. Doesn't ask him again about more than these. He's asking the simple question, do you love me? But again, Jesus is asking agapaso. And again, Peter cannot bring himself to use that particular Greek word. And so again, he says, you know that I philo you. And Jesus then says, tend my sheep. That's poimane in Greek, which means tend. So tend my sheep. First of all, it was feed my lambs. Now it's tend my sheep. And then Jesus asks, notice a shift here. Then Jesus asks, Peter, do you phileus me? And it says Peter was grieved because he asks the third time, do you phileus me? You know, sometimes we read this passage and we think that he is grieved because Jesus has asked him the same question the third time. But actually, when you see the Greek, what is happening here is Peter is grieved because Jesus has stepped it down a level. He's not saying agapeo this time. Jesus has stepped it down. Effectively, what Jesus has said, because Peter has said, yes, I'm a deep friend of yours, twice. Yes, I'm a deep friend of yours. And the third time, Jesus effectively seems to be saying, Peter, are you really a deep friend of mine? Standing in front of this fire, where the last time Peter was standing in front of a fire, being challenged 3 times, was when he denied Christ 3 times. And here Jesus has said, do you really love me? Do you really phileus me? And grieved, Peter replies, Lord, you know all things. You know I philo you. He still cannot bring himself. He can't even then bring himself to the point to amplify it, to bring it up to this agapeo level. He had an opportunity there actually to say, Lord, I don't just phileo you, I agapeo you. But he still can't bring himself. He's hurting inside. He's in pain inside. And then Jesus uses this Greek word boske again and says, feed my sheep. He's asking Peter to be a shepherd. First of all, he says, feed my lambs. Then he says, tend my sheep. And then he says, feed my sheep. There is an increasing level of responsibility. You know, lambs are like children. There's a feeding is kind of like a teaching. Teach the children. Look after the people. and finally feed the people. He's moved it up 3 levels. A man who has failed Jesus, a man who has denied him 3 times, is being brought through this process, through these 3 questions, through a process of Jesus gently lifting him up. Even though this man feels so guilty, so heartbroken that he cannot bring himself to use this word agapeo, can only bring himself to use this word philia, Jesus nevertheless accepts what he is receiving from this man and gives him 3 levels of responsibility, building up in each case. You know, there are a lot of people in churches who come in and who want to get involved in teaching, where what the church really needs is people who actually look after the other people. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a pastor of a large church in Turkey. He said he had these couple of American guys turn up one day, completely out of the blue. They hadn't made any appointment or anything, and they came in and they said, you know, we want to come in and serve your church. And he said, great, thank you very much. So they said, when can we start? He said, you can start right away. Here are some cleaning equipment. Please go and clean the toilets. And I said, we haven't come here to do that. We've come here to teach. And he said, if you're not prepared to clean my toilets, you're not worthy to teach my people. First job that needs to be done in a church is to look after the people. And then Jesus brings this prophetic word. When you were young, you could dress yourself and go wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. Others will dress you and take you to places you don't want to go. And Peter's fate was that he ended up by being crucified upside down. As the story goes, when they told him that they were going to crucify him, he said, I'm actually not worthy enough to die in the same way that my Lord died. And they said, we are going to crucify you. He said, then crucify me upside down. I don't want to be in the same position as Jesus was when he was crucified. And so he was crucified upside down. And then Jesus, after having said that, said, follow me. And Peter turned round and saw John. Now, John never writes about himself in his gospel in the first person. Never says, and he turned round and he saw me. He never talks about, and I was leaning on Jesus' breast. He always just talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, I don't think John was effectively saying that Jesus loved him and he didn't love anybody else. I don't think he's even saying that Jesus loved him more than anybody else. In describing himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, I think all he is actually doing is assenting to the fact that he knows that he is loved by Jesus. He is one who knows that he is fully loved, and he loves the Lord as well. And I find it interesting that the passage actually, I've left it out off of this slide, but the passage actually reminds us, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then it goes on in parenthesis that he was the one who leant on Jesus' breast. He was the one who asked, who is it that is going to betray you? Isn't it interesting that this description of a disciple who loves Jesus comes immediately after this passage of Jesus asking Peter this question 3 times? Do you love me? But Peter turns and sees John. He's just been told by Jesus, follow me. Peter turns and sees John and then says, and what about this man? because John is following them. He's following on behind. I guess they must be walking down the beach at this point, having this conversation. What about this man? And Jesus says, if it is my will that he remains until I come, what's that to you? I'm talking to you at the moment, Peter. My instruction to you is you follow me. What I do with this man, that has nothing to do with you. You and I are having a conversation at the moment. I've said to you, follow me. This has nothing to do with you. You have to follow me. Jesus is pressing that point. He's creating a moment of personal intimacy with Peter. This is a conversation he's been having with Peter that's purely between him and Peter. There's a repairing job to do. There is a man who has denied Jesus 3 times who is hurting. And Jesus wants his full attention and wants to pay him full attention. We're not discussing anybody else here, Peter. We're discussing you. I want you to follow me. As you know, we've often talked about the quote from Gerald Coates that says that there is no amount of good that you can do that is capable of getting you into heaven. But then again, there's no amount of evil you can do that is capable of keeping you out. Peter has denied Christ 3 times. There are other passages you can read in Scripture which imply that if you deny Christ, you are finished. But there is no amount of evil you can do that is capable of keeping you out of heaven. There is nothing you can do wrong that God will say, you have completely blown it, I'm going to have nothing more to do with you. If you have a repentant heart and you come before God, he will redeem you. There is nothing you can do to create that separation between you and God. If you have a repentant heart, he will always take you back. Always take you back. There is never a permanent cutting off. And Jesus wants this personal moment with Peter to say, look, you and I are going to continue with a relationship. You still have a purpose in my kingdom. You are still somebody I love and that I want in my kingdom to work with me. It's nothing to do with you. You follow me. And then the next verse, so the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. But Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remains until I come. What is that to you? And do you know that idea of John never dying still pervades to this day among, as well as others, the Mormons? Church of the Latter-day Saints believes that John is still alive today as a result of that verse. But I haven't read this verse. They haven't put this verse into its proper context. But what is interesting is that there are some things associated with this which again creates, as I mentioned at the beginning, a certain amount of misrepresentation of John. Let's just go back and remind ourselves that we touched on the very first teaching on John. But John was the brother of James, the son of Zebedee. They were called the sons of thunder. And Jesus often, when he went out, took only Peter, James, and John with him when they went out to do certain things. So James and John, who were brothers, they were there, plus Peter. It was James and John that requested, as having been pushed by their mother, request that you can sit on either side of Jesus in heaven. And Jesus says, well, actually, those places are not mine to give. And then, if you remember, we learned that we were told in Acts that James, who's John's brother, was killed by Herod with a sword. He was, in fact, the first recorded martyr, first recorded Christian martyr. John himself went on to found churches in Smyrna, Pergamos, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Thyatira, and possibly Ephesus, because there are some indications that Paul was coming to a church that had already been founded, that had already been started. There were two main levels of persecution during the first 100 years. The first persecution occurred only in Rome under Nero. Only in Rome. It did not occur outside of Rome. And so what you actually see a lot in Acts during this period is that where Paul is going around various places and he's being arrested and taken in before tribunals, even being taken in before Roman authorities, the Roman authorities, if you read these accounts carefully, you'll see that they actually are saying, take it away, this has nothing to do with us, we cannot prosecute in these cases. Partly because Christianity and Judaism were both regarded as part of the same sects of Judaism, and Judaism at that time was a protected religion which had been protected since a decree by the Medes and the Persians. And so actually, technically speaking, in the Roman Empire, it was illegal to persecute a Jew, and by extension was illegal to persecute a Christian. But in Rome, Nero had taken particular exception to Christians and had begun a persecution in Rome against the law. And in fact, it's believed that Peter was crucified during the great fire of Rome that had been started by Nero. But a second wave of persecution came under the Emperor Domitian. And Domitian, for some reason, absolutely hated the very idea of Christianity and launched this massive campaign of persecution. And that spread right out throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. Domitian knew that there were certain senators in Rome who were also Christians, and he had them executed or exiled. He confiscated all of their lands so that their families could no longer have the land and houses in possession. And that occurred around about AD 81. And under Emperor Domitian, John was arrested in Ephesus and sent to Rome, where Domitian ordered John's execution. And so, in a crowded Colosseum, John was brought out to be publicly executed in this crowded Colosseum. And the means of execution chosen was to boil him in oil. He was cast into this cauldron of boiling oil, and he was completely unharmed. A miracle witnessed by thousands sitting in the Colosseum watching this incident. It is actually said the entire audience committed their lives to Christ on witnessing that miracle. Whether it was the entire audience or whether it was just simply thousands and thousands, we don't know. We don't have the actual figures. But having taken him out of the oil, having survived this, and by the way, others were also thrown into that cauldron and died a hideous death by burning and scalding. Only John was brought out completely unmarked, completely unharmed, not a blemish on his body. Domitian, so furious, demanded that he be put to death immediately by stabbing. And we don't know why it didn't work, but they couldn't even stab him. They couldn't even kill him by stabbing. So Domitian banished him to the Isle of Patmos. Couldn't kill him, so sent him to Patmos. And this is partly why the myth that John would not die perpetuated. But John did die. He actually ended up by dying in Ephesus. There is actually a tomb there to this day, which is John's tomb in Ephesus. He did die. He died of old age of natural causes. And is in fact the only disciple to have not died a violent death. So as we know, when he was on the Isle of Patmos, he wrote the book of Revelation. In fact, again, we touched on this in the introduction, but John wrote 3 types of book. He wrote a history, the gospel. He wrote 3 epistles, and he wrote a prophecy, Revelation. It's interesting that that's all he wrote when he basically had said there is so much more to tell about Jesus that if we told everything in detail, the whole world wouldn't be big enough to contain the number of books written. And yet in the end, he actually only wrote 5 books. They're pretty good ones, I have to say, but just 5 of them. John had further influence from there. And anybody who knows any of the names of the early church fathers might be interested to know that John actually trained Polycarp himself. Trained him himself. He was a student of John's. And Polycarp became the bishop of Smyrna. And Polycarp then taught and trained Irenaeus. So Polycarp and Irenaeus are 2 of the church fathers who were actually quite prolific in their writings and are well known. And John later, after he trained Polycarp, also went on to train Ignatius, who became the bishop of Antioch. So the church fathers had heard direct testimony directly from John about the life of Christ. And so in their writings, they are able to record, even though they did not know Christ themselves personally as the living Christ on earth, they had heard firsthand from John, had been trained firsthand from John, all about who Jesus was. And so John is one of these incredible people who has not only enjoyed a strong life and strong relationship with Christ, he has written books where he's talked about in terms of being John the Divine, because his writings are so amazing in their perfection, the way they are written. And as some of you will remember, when we were talking about Genesis and we were looking at the mathematics of Genesis and how Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, you apply a particular formula to it and you get pi to 5 decimal places, how John chapter 1 verse 1, the only other book in the Bible that begins in the beginning, gives us Euler's number e to 5 decimal places using exactly the same formula. John seems to have had the same Spirit of God on him to be able to write scripture that Moses had when he wrote Genesis. John, therefore, has become a very powerful influence, both not only in having this gospel that he has written, which is so full of sevens, so full of, it's the gospel that's all about Jesus as God, and that he has brought this whole revelation of who Jesus is in this prophecy, the book of Revelation. And you'll remember we touched on that a few weeks ago, where we looked at Revelation and saw how Revelation is a book that reveals much more about Jesus than one might first see in looking at it. He is somebody who really had a clear understanding coming directly from God, and has written much and has influenced much in the early writings of the early church.